All right, welcome today to our lesson about leaves. Um, Leaves are some of the most important organs of plants because they are the factories which produce a plant's food. Um, as such, they not only build food for the plant, but they also create most of the building blocks for building plant tissue itself. The cell walls of plants are composed of cellulose, and cellulose itself is composed of long chains of glucose or sugar. We know that sugar is the product of photosynthesis, so the ability to produce new cells and create cell walls itself is tied to photosynthesis, and that process is required for growth. So leaves are not only building sugars through the process of photosynthesis, they are also building the building blocks of plant tissue. Um, this is the entire survival strategy of plants. Unlike animals or fungi, which rely on other organisms for food, plants are capable of making their own food. So when we approach our understanding of a leaf primarily as a factory for building food and other materials to fuel plant growth, um, I think that's kind of a useful paradigm to have to think about leaves as factories of food production. Um, Leaves have several functions. Leaves are the plant organ system responsible for photosynthesis, which is the process of taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the soil and hydrating that carbon to make carbohydrates or sugars. And then oxygen is a waste product of that process. So that's how plants make food. Plants' leaves are also responsible for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is something that all cells need to do in order to consume food. The maintenance of a plant cell and plant tissues requires those cells to do work. Um, they have to maintain themselves, they have to repair membranes, they have to, all the tissues in a plant have some kind of function. They're all doing work in order to keep the entire organism alive. And cellular respiration is basically the process by which um, a cell reacts a food source with oxygen in order to release chemical energy to do work. And then the waste products of that reaction are water and carbon dioxide. And leaves also perform transpiration. Transpiration is a little bit more complex. The slide that I've written about transpiration is probably too many words on one slide, but we're going to go really slowly and talk about transpiration in a minute. It's just kind of a complex process that makes more sense to explain with some more detailed images and explanations. But essentially, transpiration is the way that plants transport water from the soil up the stem and into the leaves while expending no energy to do so. Even if the plant is lifting water 300 feet, the plant expends absolutely no energy to transport water against the force of gravity. And it also allows the pores in the leaf that allow oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the leaf to remain open. So we'll talk more about transpiration in a minute. It's a little bit complex. Um, Leaves can also be modified to have a variety of specialized functions, and I wish I could say that this list is comprehensive. It probably is not. Um, Among the things that a plant can modify its leaves to do are mechanical protection. For example, cactuses have spines. Victoria water lilies have veins on the undersides of the leaves that have large spines as well to protect them from herbivores. Leaves can also be modified to store water, as we see in many, many different kinds of succulent plants. Um, Leaves can be modified for water collection. Many plants have leaves that are arranged in such a way that when rainfall hits the leaf surface, the water is funneled toward the stem and either down to the roots, or it could be held within these buckets that the leaves make, which is something we see in bromeliads, which helps the uh, the leaf hold water. We could also see that leaves can help attract pollinators to the flowers of a plant. Um, Leaves can also help a plant climb and hold on to structures as the stem of the plant climbs, as we see in many of our vining plants. Some plants have the ability to propagate themselves from their leaves. They can produce either little baby pups from the leaf, or they could have the leaves fall to the ground, root in, and then produce a baby plant from the base of the leaf. Plants can also be modified for food storage. That's something we see in bulbs. The scales or layers of bulbs are actually modified leaves that are used to store food and water. And leaves can also be used to acquire mineral nutrients. Most of the time, plants are using their roots to acquire mineral nutrients, but in the case of many of our carnivorous plants that are growing in nutrient poor soils where water washes away all of the, and dissolves and washes away all the mineral nutrients, our carnivorous plants instead lure insects into traps and then digest them in order to acquire essential mineral nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, etc. Photosynthesis is the first and probably the most important function that leaves perform, and almost all of the structure of a leaf is set up to optimize the process of photosynthesis. So, photosynthesis is a process by which plants react carbon dioxide, which they are absorbing from the air, from the atmosphere, with water, and they're getting that water from the soil. They're absorbing that through the roots, up through the stem, and into the leaves. And they're powering a chemical reaction between carbon dioxide and water using the energy from sunlight to make food. And the food product that they're making are carbohydrates, which makes a lot of sense. We're looking at carbon dioxide, we're reacting with water, and we're making a carbohydrate, or more often we refer to these as sugars or starches. Um, I have provided here a chemical equation for photosynthesis. We can see that we can react 6 carbon dioxide molecules with 6 water molecules. And with the input of energy from sunlight, we can receive or produce 1 molecule of glucose or sugar. And we also produce as a waste product 6 molecules of oxygen. Um, if we count up the carbons, and if we count up the oxygens, and if we count up the hydrogens on either side of this equation, we have the same number of all of the atoms on either side of this chemical equation. So this is a balanced chemical equation, um, which is important to make sure that we're keeping our chemical equations balanced, so that we really understand how many reagents and how many products we get out of any particular reaction. Um, it's important to know that where the plant gets its raw materials. I've had students before who thought that maybe the plant was getting, um, maybe it was getting its water from rain on the leaves, or maybe they thought that the oxygen was coming from water. And, that's not totally the case. The plant is getting carbon dioxide, it's breathing it into the surface of the leaf through little breathing pores called stomata, and the water is coming from the soil. Um, this is a good word to know. Plants are autotrophs. Auto means self, and troph means feed. You might be familiar with automobiles, which are self-moving vehicles. They don't require horses to pull them. Okay. Or you might be familiar with trophic levels in a food chain. Higher trophic levels are near the top of the food chain, and lower trophic levels are near the bottom of the food chain. So auto is self, troph is feed or food. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food, and that certainly describes plants. Organisms that feed on other organisms are known as heterotrophs or other feeders. Within plant cells, um, the process of photosynthesis doesn't just occur anywhere in a plant cell. It occurs in a specific organelle. And for those of you who have maybe not been in a high school biology unit for a little bit too long, organelles are basically the tiny little organs within a cell. They're not really, organelles themselves aren't alive. A cell is the smallest unit of life. But the organelles are basically these structures or like machines almost inside of the cell that do the work that's required to keep the cell alive. All of the different organelles have different functions that support the processes of life to continue within the cell. And in plant cells, chloroplasts are the organelles which are responsible for the photosynthesis reaction. Chloroplasts themselves have several parts. The chloroplast has both an inner and outer membrane, and then within the inner membrane, there's some space, which is called the stroma. And within the stroma, we find little membrane sacs called thylakoids that almost resemble like little pancakes. And the thylakoids are probably the most important part of the chloroplast because they are performing a series of chemical reactions across their membranes that together make up the complete photosynthesis reaction. So that's called the electron transport chain. It's actually a series of smaller steps, stepwise reactions to complete our whole photosynthesis reaction. I will not be going into the electron transport chain in detail because that's more of like an undergrad biochemistry course subject. I think we spent almost an entire week on the electron transport chain of photosynthesis when I took university biochemistry. I'm not going to make you learn the electron transport chain, but basically it's a series of chemical reactions that perform an oxidation reduction reaction. In this case, it's a reduction reaction of carbon dioxide to create glucose. And that reaction, like I say, is occurring across the thylakoid membrane. The most important thing to know with regard to the electron transport chain is that basically within the chloroplast, the thylakoid can create a different electrochemical um, environment within the sac of the thylakoid compared to the stroma, which is the outside of the thylakoid. And it's utilizing that electrochemical difference in concentrations of different molecules in order to drive that reaction forward to make sugar as a result of photosynthesis. The thylakoids are not just randomly scattered throughout the chloroplast. The thylakoids are found in little stacks called grana, and the configuration of the grana depends a lot on the developmental environment of the leaf. When a leaf develops in a full bright sunlight condition, um, the pigments, the green pigments called chlorophylls, which plants use to perform photosynthesis, they break down in sunlight. That's actually a part of the photosynthesis reaction is the breakdown of chlorophyll. Um, so the plant actually wants to protect the chlorophyll a little bit and shade it partially if the sunlight intensity is very, very high. So the plant will actually stack up its grana in order to prevent excessive degradation of the chlorophyll molecules. Um, when plants are growing in deep shade, they tend to space out their thylakoids rather than organizing them in stacks called grana. Um, and that basically ensures that all the thylakoids are kind of equally exposed to as much light as possible in a lower light condition. It's also the reason why if you take a plant that's been growing in the shade and then you move it into the sun, it will horribly sunburn. It's not a good idea to move plants between different light levels because the chloroplasts within cells in leaves that have developed in either the sun or the shade have different thylakoid and grana structure. And it can be really injuring to those tissues to be moved to a new light level because they don't typically have a good ability to rearrange those grana once they've been organized. The internal anatomy of a leaf is I think, valuable to know so that we can really understand how optimized this system is for the photosynthetic process. I like to think of the internal anatomy of a leaf kind of like a lasagna. Lasagna has a series of predictable layers. You put down a layer of noodles or a layer of the sauce maybe first, and then a layer of noodles, and then maybe a layer of uh, sauce and then cheese and then more noodles, then more sauce, then more cheese, and so on, all the way up to the top of the lasagna pan. Um, we can think of something similar occurring in the inside of a leaf. There are these layers, they all have different functions. Um, so yeah, I like to call it the lasagna model of the leaf. Um, the first layer we're going to look at, because we're going to move from the top of the leaf down. The first layer we're going to look at is the cuticle. You may be familiar with the cuticle, which is the dead layer of skin, which will grow out over the top of your fingernails or toenails. Um, in plants, the cuticle is not composed of old dead skin. It is composed of waxy materials. And if you are very familiar with wax, you will know that it can be used to waterproof things. The cuticle can have two kind of main functions. One is to keep water inside the leaf to reduce water loss um, from the leaf tissue to prevent it from drying out. And the other function can actually be to keep water out of the leaf. Many of our tropical house plants that are very popular, for example, peace lilies or epipremnum or philodendrons, many of them have a very, very waxy, glossy leaf surface, and that glossy, waxy leaf surface is created by the cuticle. A lot of people say that plants with a really thick cuticle look like they're made out of plastic, but it's actually wax. And you can imagine that if you're a plant growing in a rainforest, there is a real danger of your tissues becoming soaked and destroyed by excessive water. Um, think about like sitting in a bathtub too long, the tips of your fingers, the skin starts to become very soft and wrinkled up and odd. If you had to stay in that bathtub for weeks on end, like a rainforest plant during the rainy season, your skin might rot away. So plants have to have not only mechanisms for holding water inside the leaf in dry climates, which is more common of a problem, but also a way to keep excess water out of the leaf to prevent those tissues from becoming waterlogged and rotting away. The next layer we see is the epidermis. This is the skin of the leaf. It's typically a pretty thin layer. And this makes leaves a little bit more susceptible to damage because they don't have a thick multi-layered skin the way animals do. But a thin epidermis is required in order to allow light into the cell. If they had a thicker epidermis, it would not allow light to enter the cell, and those cells would not be able to perform photosynthesis effectively. Our next layer is the palisade mesophyll. Um, Mesophyll means middle leaf. Meso is a Greek root meaning middle, phyll means leaf. And this is soft parenchymatous tissue. Parenchyma is just a type of plant cell that's pretty soft. Um, and the palisade mesophyll has some interesting characteristics. It is composed of these vertically stacked, packed, I should say, tightly packed vertical cells, which are under the epidermis. And we see that these cells contain numerous chloroplasts. They are some of the most chloroplastically dense cells a plant will produce. And as such, they perform the majority of the photosynthesis within a leaf. Um, I've had a lot of people ask me, well, why would the palisade mesophyll be composed of vertical cells rather than cells spread out to more effectively capture sunlight? And maybe you're already thinking about the fact that a lot of the light that intercepts a leaf is actually, or I should say, a lot of the light that shines on a leaf is not actually intercepted by the chloroplast. Some of the light will shine right through the leaf without the energy from that sunlight being captured. So by having a taller, more vertical cell, the the plant can guarantee, or I should say, the plant can improve the percentage of the light that it's able to intercept as that beam of light passes through the leaf. There's a greater likelihood that light will be intercepted by a chloroplast and be useful for photosynthesis. Um, just under the palisade mesophyll, we have the spongy mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll is another soft tissue layer composed of loosely packed cells. And the reason it's important that these cells be loosely packed is they allow the flow of gases through the leaf. The leaf is mostly taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it's also producing oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis. So we need a way to get our waste product, oxygen, out of the leaf. If the airspace within the leaf, within the spongy mesophyll, gets totally filled up with oxygen and there's no carbon dioxide available, then there's no way to um, for the photosynthesis reaction to proceed because we will be missing one of the ingredients for that reaction to occur. So we've got to be able to get our waste gas, oxygen, out of the leaf, and we've got to have a way of transporting our carbon dioxide evenly through the leaf as well. Um, and that's why the spongy mesophyll has to be loosely packed, is to allow the free movement of gases throughout the internal surface of the leaf. Sorry, the internal um, tissues of the leaf. We also see veins in our leaves. The veins are composed of vascular bundles of xylem and phloem. Are the cells that transport water and mineral nutrients into the leaf from the soil. And xylem only transports resources in one direction, and that's up. So we just have water flowing into the leaf, and we only have mineral nutrients flowing into the leaf, not out. Phloem can do bidirectional flow. So phloem can transport products of photosynthesis into or out of the leaf. And that's super important because our products of photosynthesis, like sugars, can be used to build cell walls and fuel plant growth. So if you're a dormant broadleaf tree in the spring, you have no leaves, in late winter, early spring. So you might want to move sugars upward to the tips of your stems and fuel the growth of new shoots and leaves by moving sugar upward. Once you've got your leaves grown and developed for the year, now those leaves are producing sugar. And so you might choose to reverse the flow and start sending sugars down to the roots to support root growth and development. So xylem is just transporting water and mineral nutrients up into the leaf, but phloem is able to transport the products of photosynthesis, such as sugars, into or out of the leaf, depending on the season and the requirements of the plant. Um, the last feature in this layer that we need to know of are the stomata. The stomata is plural for stoma. Stoma means mouth in Greek, okay? And these are breathing pores in the lower epidermis. So we have another layer of skin on the bottom of a leaf, and we also have a lower cuticle as well. So there's a layer of wax on the bottom of the leaf as well. And the stomata are almost always at the bottom of the leaf. The reason they would want to be, the plant would want to have, and plants don't really want anything. I'm anthropomorphizing them a little bit here, but the reason why it would be advantageous for a plant to have more stomata on the bottom of the leaf is that way they're shaded. Um, when we think about um, gases being heated, we know that warm gases rise. Think about, for example, when you boil water on a stove. The water vapor, that gaseous water, it rises because it's hotter than the surrounding gas. It's less dense. Hot substances tend to expand and it forms a convection current that moves upward. If you put a piece of dry ice in the same pot, because that's a cold carbon dioxide gas that is off gassing from your chunk of dry ice, that vapor is going to fall to the floor because it's cold and it's more dense than the surrounding air. Um, if a leaf had stomata on the top of the leaf, the water loss from the leaf would be substantially worse because that leaf is going to be sitting in the sun. The water inside the leaf is going to be quite warm. And as it evaporates from within the leaf, um, through those breathing pores, it will move upward, which means that if we had stomata on the top of the leaf, we would basically have chimneys that are allowing a lot of warm water vapor to escape from the leaf. So the leaf instead has stomata on the underside, and that means that any warm water vapor is mostly going to stay, or I should say, not mostly going to stay, but more of it is going to stay within the leaf and maintain a high humidity environment within the leaf so that the cells of the leaf don't dry out. And ultimately, the purpose of the stomata is to allow carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the leaf and to allow oxygen, which is a waste product of photosynthesis, to escape the leaf. The stomata have on either side what are called guard cells that look like a little pair of lips. This is where they get the name stomata. They look like a little mouth or a little pair of lips. And the guard cells, that's a pair of cells, they surround each stomata, and when they are turgid, meaning inflated with water, um, they kind of expand like little balloons and they hold the opening of the stomata open. Um, when the plant starts to enter a state of water stress and no longer has enough water to keep the guard cells inflated, um, those guard cells will collapse when they wilt, and they will close the stomata. And this has to occur in order to conserve water under drought stress conditions. A plant that is water stressed does not want to be losing water vapor through the surface of the leaf just in order to have, a breathing pore open to get some carbon dioxide into the leaf. It's more important that the cells not desiccate and dry out and die than that we have optimal photosynthesis occurring. Um, Keep in mind that if guard cells are closed, photosynthesis cannot proceed because because carbon dioxide can't get into the leaf. If carbon dioxide can't get into the leaf because the guard cells are closed, because the plant is experiencing water stress and the guard cells have wilted and closed, we can't grow. So if you were, managing a greenhouse and nursery, if your plants are always wilted because you're not watering regularly enough, you're not going to see optimal growth because your stomata are closed. And if they're closed because of water stress, you can't get carbon dioxide in the leaf. We can't hydrate that carbon to make carbohydrates, so no growth is going to be able to occur. Um, we've been talking about the process of photosynthesis, but not quite so much about how the light is captured. Um, the pigments or colorful molecules that plants use to absorb energy from sunlight are called chlorophylls. And I'm going to talk about them as in the plural, always chlorophylls, because there are multiple. The most notable are chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Um, and as green pigments, they mostly reflect green light back to your eye, which is why we perceive most plants as green. Um, because they reflect green light, they don't absorb green light well. They absorb energy from other wavelengths, mostly from the red and blue wavelengths, and they use those for photosynthesis. Um, when we look at a chlorophyll molecule, there's a long phytol tail. Each intersection or joint in this stick diagram represents a carbon, and every line represents a bond. So, like I say, every joint is a carbon, every line is a bond, and we can see that we have this long tail, and then we have this kind of network with a magnesium molecule in the middle. That magnesium molecule is super important for transferring energy captured from sunlight out of the chlorophyll pigment and into the electron transport chain in the thylakoids in order for the reactions of photosynthesis to proceed. Um, when we see leaves change color in the fall, that's because the plant is actually trying to conserve the building materials of chlorophyll. That magnesium molecule in there is very, very valuable to the plant. That's a mineral nutrient that they have to get from the soil. And they don't want to shed their leaves when they still have chlorophyll in them because that means that they're wasting nutrients. Those nutrients are going to be reincorporated back into the soil as the leaves decay, and the tree can't guarantee that it gets to use them next year. That magnesium might be absorbed by the roots of another plant, or maybe it will be absorbed by a fungus, and now the plant can't use it. So um, plants will actually break down the chlorophyll in their leaves in the fall, and they will reabsorb or resorb as much of the chlorophyll and other nutrients out of the leaves as they can before the leaves fall. And that actually reveals other pigments inside the leaf, like carotenoids and anthocyanins. Carotenoids are yellow, orange, or red pigments that plants are using to capture energy from the blue-green wavelengths in sunlight for photosynthesis. So we've talked about how chlorophyll reflects green light, but carotenoids, which are yellow or orange, they can absorb green light. And so they help plants capture some of the green light that is produced by the sun. The sun produces white light, and white light contains all of the other wavelengths. So it basically just helps the leaves of plants be a little bit more efficient in capturing a greater range of different light wavelengths, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth about in a second. Um, when you see a plant that has yellow or orange fall leaves, you're seeing the carotenoids. The plant is breaking down chlorophyll and reabsorbing the nutrients from which it's composed, and it's leaving those carotenoids within the leaf. The carotenoids are mostly made of carbon. You can see that they don't contain any special mineral nutrients like magnesium. They just contain carbon. So the plant can pretty easily make new carotenoids just by doing photosynthesis, which makes them a little bit less valuable to the plant. These carotenoids are also really powerful antioxidants. You might be familiar with lycopene, which is in watermelon and also in tomatoes, or with beta carotene, which is the pigment that makes carrots orange. And both of those are really valuable antioxidants and plant nutrients that we like to have in our diet because they help protect our cells. Anthocyanins are the next group of pigments that plants can produce in their leaves, and they are red, violet, or blue pigments that protect plant tissues from excessive light radiation. The reason I say red, violet, or blue is actually because anthocyanins are pH indicators. If you treat anthocyanin pigments with an acid, they will tend to turn more red, and if you treat them with an alkaline substance, they will tend to turn more blue. So their pH, the color of an individual anthocyanin molecule a lot of times depends on the chemical conditions in which that pigment finds itself. Red fall leaves are colored by anthocyanins. Once again, those are protective against excessive radiation, and so they help protect the tissues of the plant as the plant is pulling out nutrients like the components of chlorophyll and other plant nutrients. It prevents those leaves from getting destroyed by solar radiation while they're kind of cleaning out the cupboards and pulling all those nutrients back into the stems of the plant. Anthocyanins are also interesting because they can deter insect feeding. I provided here 3 different examples of anthocyanin pigmentation in plants because we see this in more than just fall leaves. The first one I've provided, this big image of this red maple. This is fall color of a red maple. During the summer, their leaves are green. And those anthocyanins, like I said, are protecting the tissues of the leaf as the plant reabsorbs as much of the nutrient content of the leaf as it can before it sheds the leaf. In the bottom, I provided 2 different images. I provided the growing tip of a rose stem. And you can see how the leaves, when they're young, have red pigmentation. Those leaves are not fully developed yet. So by containing high concentrations of anthocyanins, they can guarantee that those immature juvenile tissues are protected from solar damage. And also, if you've ever grown roses, you'll know that aphids and other insects, they like to attack the tips of the stems the best. Those anthocyanins also have a protective effect against insect feeding. So the redder your new growth on your roses is, typically the healthier they are, and the more protected against insect feeding they'll be. I've also provided an image of a red cabbage. We're probably all familiar with red cabbages and green cabbages. This is caused by a genetic mutation that causes these cabbages to overproduce anthocyanins. And these purple-leafed plants are popular in our kitchens, but also in gardens. There are many trees that have purple leaves, and that is due to genetic mutations which cause the overproduction of anthocyanins, which can be valuable from an ornamental viewpoint. Talking a little bit more about pigments and photosynthesis, I think it's really important to understand how the electromagnetic spectrum is related to photosynthesis. So at the top, in the top corner, I've got an image of or a model of the electromagnetic spectrum, And really, the electromagnetic spectrum is just all of the different types of radiation that can exist. Our lowest energy radiation are radio waves, and our highest energy radiation are gamma waves. As the energy of the wavelength increases, the wavelength becomes smaller. Remember that all light radiation moves at the speed of light, regardless of what type of radiation it is. So if a gamma ray is oscillating upward and downward much more rapidly, but still traveling horizontally at the same speed, it would have to contain much more energy than a radio wave. Plants are not using the majority of the electromagnetic spectrum to do photosynthesis. They are using the visible light spectrum. Excuse me. Um, and they are capturing energy from the visible light radiation using pigments. Pigments are substances that just reflect certain wavelengths of visible light. Um, but it's not the reflection of light that is important here. What's most important to a plant is not the reflection, but the absorption of other wavelengths. Green pigments like chlorophyll A and B, they reflect green light. So when we look at the visible light spectrum, we can see that green light is around 600 nanometers. Um, so most of the light in that range is not available to plants. So when we look at this graph down below, we can see that at a wavelength of 600 nanometers, the absorption, the actual photochemical efficiency and the absorption of energy from sunlight is very, very low. That's kind of the lowest point in the graph. Um, but chlorophyll does absorb red wavelength in the 700 nanometer range and blue light in the 400 nanometer range super well. So we can see that there are spikes in our graph in the 4 to 500 range and then down in by the 700 range where chlorophyll absorbs light super well. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people's grow lights look purple, is because there's actually a combination of red LED bulbs and blue LED bulbs to provide those wavelengths of light that are best absorbed by chlorophyll. You'll notice that we do have a carotenoid on this graph as well. We have beta carotene. And we can see that the peak absorption for beta carotene is pushing into that green wavelength area between 500 and 600 nanometers. And that's where we're able to absorb a little bit of that green light to enhance photosynthesis somewhat, even with light that cannot be absorbed by chlorophyll. Um, Cellular respiration is often thought of as a process that just animals do. This is basically eating food and releasing energy from food. Um, this is how plants release and use energy from glucose. So we are reacting one molecule of glucose or sugar with, and I've got a mistake here, it should say 6 molecules of oxygen. We're going to release chemical energy, and then we're going to have 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules released as waste products. Um, Animals famously do this. We eat sugar, we breathe in oxygen, we release energy to do work within our bodies, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide and water. But plants have to do this as well. And plants have to do this as well in order to maintain their tissues and do the work inside of each cell that's required for their processes of life to occur and keep the cells of the plant alive. Um, when we compare cellular respiration to photosynthesis, we can see that it's the exact same reaction in reverse. So rather than reacting glucose and oxygen to release energy, and then producing carbon dioxide and water as waste products. In photosynthesis, we are reacting water from the soil and carbon dioxide from the air together. We're capturing energy from sunlight in order to drive that chemical reaction to completion. And then as products, we're producing glucose and oxygen as a waste product. Um, Why would plants need to use some of the energy they store as sugar? If we don't ever use the energy, the cells can't stay alive. The cells consume energy in order to stay alive. So some of the food always has to be eaten, just kind of as a base level to keep the plant alive. Ideally, we're doing more photosynthesis than cellular respiration. And if we're doing more photosynthesis than respiration, we have a positive net production of sugars, which will allow growth to occur. Um, when we look at the level of light and our rate of photosynthesis, it's really important to be aware of both photosynthesis and cellular respiration and how light is related to those processes. So, the light compensation point is the amount of light at which it's the amount of light provided at which your respiration rate equals your photosynthetic rate. So at this amount of lighting, a plant is able to do just barely enough photosynthesis to meet its basal metabolic demands, right? So the plant has kind of a minimum metabolic expenditure of energy every single day in order to do the minimum processes that are required to keep cells alive and healthy. Um, so we're capturing just as much energy as we are using up or releasing. Um, a lot of house plants are, I think, unfortunately, kind of kept at a light compensation point. Some people have a plant in a place where it's bright enough to not die, but it's not bright enough for the plant to actually grow. And that's probably because the plant's sitting at the light compensation point. Um, as we increase the amount of light, the rate of photosynthesis increases, and we're going to see an increase in the rate of growth of the plant up until the light saturation point. The light saturation point is the point at which additional light or the addition of additional light is no longer going to increase the rate of photosynthesis. You can think about the leaf as a factory or a machine whose job it is to produce sugar. And there's a certain point at which delivering more resources to a factory does not help the factory produce more product. The machinery is saturated, it's running as fast as it possibly can, and adding more light does not help the factory run any faster. So that's the light saturation point. Pmax is the maximum rate of photosynthesis that can occur under ideal lighting conditions. And we can see Pmax as a line on our graph with photosynthesis represented by the y-axis of this graph and light intensity represented by the x-axis. Um, photosynthesis for any individual species, every individual species is going to have its own Pmax. That's going to be the maximum amount of photosynthesis the plant is capable of doing. If we continue to increase the light intensity beyond the light saturation point, we might be okay for a little bit, but eventually you can provide so much light that you start to impose excessive light stress on the plant. And that will actually start to reduce the rate of photosynthesis. And to understand this, I want you to think about what happens if you spend too much time in too much light. Human beings can also experience light stress. We call them sunburns. Um, Solar radiation is just that. It's radiation, and radiation can cause damage to the cells. Um, Excessive light can also break down chlorophyll faster than the chlorophyll can be replenished, and that will bleach the leaf. And if the light level is really, really too high, we can actually sunburn the leaf and destroy the cells and tissue within the leaf, which is going to reduce the ability of the leaf to perform photosynthesis. It's very important, I think, to be aware of these kind of 3 points: the light compensation point, the light saturation point, and photo inhibition, to understand why it's important to provide the right level of light for an individual plant. No plants can survive in total darkness. They require a minimum amount of light just to stay alive, to replace the food that the plant has to consume in order to live. The light saturation point is where we get optimal growth rate. Providing additional light is not going to help anymore. If you provide too much light, the tissue will bleach and then burn. Transpiration is, I said that I'd talk about it more in detail. I hope that I'm able to clearly communicate what transpiration is and how it occurs on this slide. Um, this can be a bit of a tricky idea to understand. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. Transpiration is a process whereby water vapor is lost through the stomata of the leaves during gas exchange. So we've already talked about the stomata and their guard cells and how those guard cells have to remain turgid or full of water in order for the stomata to remain open. And that if the plant wilts, those guard cells will collapse and close the stomata pores, and then gas exchange cannot occur. The leaf can no longer take in carbon dioxide, and so photosynthesis cannot proceed. Um, the flow of water from the roots up the stem and into the leaves is required in order to keep the stomata open and allow for that continued gas exchange. Um, so we have to have kind of a continuous flow of water in order to be able to take carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere, because we have to keep those guard cells open. Um, the water is drawn up from the soil through the roots, through the stem into the leaf using absolutely no energy. And this is a remarkable process because there are some species of tree, like giant sequoias, for example, that could grow, 250 to up to 300 feet tall. So the ability to move hundreds of gallons of water per day upward hundreds of feet without expending any energy directly is really kind of a crazy thing that plants do. And they basically do it all using just the energy from the sun, which we'll talk about. So, um, as a plant is sitting in the sun doing photosynthesis, the tissues of the leaf they warm up, right? And as they warm up, we're supplying water to the leaf so that the guard cells stay open. And because they're open, water vapor is able to escape from the underside of the leaf. Um, as the water evaporates out of the leaf, more water molecules are pulled up through the stem and into the leaf because water molecules have cohesion forces. And if you've ever overfilled a glass of water, you'll be familiar that water likes to stick to itself. Or if you've ever looked at a water droplet, the water prefers to stick to itself. So the cohesion of water molecules, you can think of it kind of like a little chain of people holding hands, right? If you pull on one person, you pull on everyone. And so as water is evaporating through the stomata, more water is pulled up through the stem. This isn't the only force that is allowing the water to move up the stem. We also have adhesion to the walls of our xylem vessels. And remember that xylem is the tissue which moves water and mineral nutrients up the stem. Um, if you ever get a cotton shirt wet, the cotton will absorb water. Cotton is made of cellulose, and cellulose is the same material that the lining of xylem tubes is composed of. So the water likes to stick to the inside of the xylem tubes, and we can observe that when we put water in a tube. Water likes to stick to certain types of substances, and it will form a meniscus. So um, those are some of the forces that are helping water be pulled up the stem as the water vapor is lost through the stomata. Um, Another thing that transpiration does that I think is often overlooked is it helps cool the plant through evaporative cooling. So as plants lose water vapor from the pores in their leaves, um, they're able to cool themselves. This is the same reason that human beings produce sweat. As the sweat evaporates, it's able to carry away um, heat and cool your body because your body heat is able to be transferred to the liquid. That liquid can then evaporate and carry away moist. It can absorb energy to evaporate to reduce the amount of energy in your body that is causing heat. Okay. Um, and this helps the plant combat its own heat stress on a hot day. But we can actually plant trees in cities as well in order to cool an entire city. One of the peculiarities about cities is they're composed almost entirely of impermeable surfaces that absorb a lot of heat. Think about roads, sidewalks, parking lots, roofs of buildings, driveways. Those are all concrete or asphalt surfaces which absorb a lot of heat. They can get extraordinarily hot on a sunny day. And then at night, those surfaces radiate heat that they absorb during the day into the atmosphere, and they keep the entire city much hotter than the surrounding environment. And that's not good for human health or safety. And cities tend to have much higher rates of um, heat stress incidents like heat stroke or heat exhaustion than surrounding rural areas because those surrounding rural areas are much cooler. So by planting an urban forest, or basically street trees and garden trees throughout an entire city, we're able to take advantage of the temperature regulating effects of transpiration in order to prevent human deaths. And this has been studied on a large scale, and cities that have much higher percentages of tree cover see a much lower risk of heat injury for people during the summer. Um, the majority of the water that a plant absorbs is actually not used for photosynthesis. The majority of the water that a plant pulls up is just lost to the atmosphere. And that is important because the plant needs to keep its stomata open. If it keeps its stomata open, that means that it's going to be losing water vapor, and it's got to keep the stomata open to allow carbon dioxide into the leaf for photosynthesis to occur. So actually, the plant is losing most of the water to transpiration. About 5% of the water is used for growth, for inflating new cells that have been produced with water in order to make stems and leaves expand. Um, but less than 1% of the water a plant absorbs is used for photosynthesis. The limiting factor for photosynthesis in a plant is usually not directly water. Water just keeps the stomata open by keeping those guard cells turgid and full of water. Um, Usually carbon dioxide and light are more significant limiting factors of transpiration. The higher the temperature is, the greater the rate of transpiration will be, and the higher the humidity is, the lower the rate of transpiration is. If you live in a very humid environment, there's already more water outside of the leaf, so there's less of a gradient or less of a difference between the amount of water vapor inside the leaf in the spongy mesophyll compared to the outside environment of the leaf. And so plants growing in a very humid environment, like a greenhouse or in a tropical rainforest, they will transpire at a somewhat lower rate. Um, Talking about leaves, it's very important to understand why most plants go dormant in the winter. The angiosperms, or the flowering plants, are of tropical origin. They originally evolved in the tropics and then had to develop special adaptations in order to survive in the temperate regions of the world. Um, as the angiosperms, or flowering plants, the broadleaf plants, spread, northward and southward out of the tropics towards each of the poles, they had to develop solutions to tolerate freezing temperatures and other risks of growing in the temperate zone. One of the most severe is from frost damage. If we look at this top left picture, we can see that these ice crystals, which have formed, in this case on the outside of the leaf, are extremely jagged and sharp. The formation of ice crystals inside of a plant cell can puncture the cell wall. It can destroy the membranes within a cell. It can destroy the nucleus of a cell. Um, and so those tissues will be destroyed by ice crystal formation within the tissues and cells of the leaf. Um, there are plants that can prevent the formation of ice crystals with anti-freezing proteins. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But certainly frost damage is a pretty serious risk. Another reason why a broadleaf temperate plant might want to go dormant in the winter is because there's limited light. The farther you go toward the poles, the shorter the days will be in winter. Um, so, for example, if you're in the North Pole, there's a several months of the year where there's actually no sunlight. Um, I grew up in Northwest Washington, and in the summer it could be light until, you know, 10, 11 at night, but during the summer, and then during the winter, it could be dark by 6. So there's just limited light, and so there's less potential for photosynthesis and growth during the winter. Another serious risk for a broadleaf plant during the winter is desiccation. So during the winter, if you live in a really cold climate, the soil is typically frozen solid. Um, and if water is solid, it cannot be absorbed by the roots. That solid water cannot be transported up the stem to replace water lost from the leaves during the process of transpiration. So if you have some dry, low humidity winter winds blowing on your plants for an extended period of time, they will wind burn. They don't have the ability to replace any water that's lost due to transpiration, so you get some serious damage. And we can see wind burn occur in these broadleaf evergreen shrubs in the top right corner. This is a problem that broadleaf evergreen plants still deal with today, and it's one of the kind of risks of planting broadleaf evergreen landscape plants. Another major risk is the snow. It's the weight of snow and ice. So the broader your leaves are, the more surface area you have above the ground, which means you have more surface area for catching the weight of snow or freezing rain. Freezing rain is particularly dangerous because if it's below freezing but rains, that rain will freeze and form a sheet of ice that progressively gets thicker and thicker the longer the bout of freezing rain continues, which increases the risk of fracture or collapse of your tree. In this bottom right hand corner, we can see a tree that was a broadleaf tree which was subjected to freezing rain, and the weight of the ice buildup on its branches has fractured the majority of the limbs, and we've got some major branches which have collapsed to the ground. Another big concern with broadleaves is that they behave like sails in the wind. The bigger a tree is and the more leaves it has, the more effective of a sail it is, which starts to become quite dangerous. In the winter, we often have very, very strong storms. Um, that canopy acts like a sail, and so the tree starts to face a really real risk of limbs breaking or the entire tree being blown over in a winter storm. Whereas if the tree loses its leaves, the wind can just blow through the bare branches, and the wind is spilled without blowing the tree over. In order to solve these problems, most of the broadleaf plants in the temperate zone are deciduous. A deciduous plant sheds its leaves during the winter, and the process of shedding the leaves is called leaf abscission. Um, Leaf abscission is basically a regulated by hormonal responses to the plant's environment. Um, you can see from this graph here that during stage 1 of the leaf, it's just the maintenance phase. That leaf continues to receive nutrients and water from the stem. It continues to do photosynthesis, but there's a number of environmental triggers such as aging, low light, exposure to ethylene, which is a plant hormone, water stress, or other stressors, which can cause a change to occur in the balance of the hormones which are produced within the leaf. Um, as growth promoting hormones decrease and maturation and senescence hormones increase, the leaf starts to change its behavior. There's a zone at the base of the leaf which is sensitive to hormones that starts to react to environmental stressors. Um, and basically, what will happen in this abscission zone is the cells will start to break down their own cell walls, which softens the tissue. And then the effect of ethylene, which is a maturation hormone, on those cells, which no longer has cell wall, causes those cells to expand. And now that we have no cell walls, the tissue is soft. And as the cells expand and become larger, they literally push the leaf right off of the stem. There's just this kind of spongy layer of cells now there that just collapse and break off the stem. Um, as this process is occurring, and really before this process occurs, deciduous plants are very invested in reabsorbing as much of their nutrients, especially nitrogen, which is used to make proteins, and also all the components of chlorophyll, out of the leaf and into the stem before the leaf is shed. Um, The reason we see the fall colors of leaves is not only because chlorophyll is reabsorbed, but also because those pigments help protect the tissues of the leaf as those resources are being absorbed. So when we look at this resorption efficiency graph, we can see that, um, er, well, just to explain, a resorption of one would be perfect resorption. That means 100% of the resources were resorbed. Um, we can see that trees with yellow or red fall color are significantly more efficient at reabsorbing nutrients like nitrogen and chlorophyll from their leaves than trees which shed green leaves at the end of the year in the fall. So that allows them to recycle more of their mineral nutrients to fuel the next year's growth. Some plants have decided that rather than shedding their leaves, they're just going to build fancier leaves that can tolerate the stresses of winter or the stresses of drought. And so rather than going dormant due to either frost or drought, they remain active. They tolerate winter or drought by having these specialized leaves called sclerophylls. That comes from Greek roots meaning hard. Sclero is hard, and then phyll is leaf. These are the thickened, tough, stiff, waxy leaves of broadleaf evergreen plants. And also, I probably just should have just said waxy leaves, sorry, thickened, tough, stiff, waxy leaves of evergreen plants. We have both broadleaf evergreen plants and our needled or scaly conifers, which also produce sclerophylls. So the harder and tougher the leaf is, the more resistant it is to damage, which means the leaf can be used for longer. And then a thick layer of wax, it makes it harder for insects to feed on the leaf because they've got to chew through a thick layer of kind of distasteful wax in order to actually start to feed on the soft leaf tissues. And it also is going to reduce water loss. So it's important to stress here that the water loss can occur in a couple different ways. This image that we have on the top, this big image of this broadleaf evergreen, this is the cherry laurel, and cherry laurels don't live in dry climates. They live in moist climates, but they do live in cold climates as well. So by having a nice thick waxy cuticle, this broadleaf evergreen can resist winter burn. If there is a drying, cold, dry wind, and the water solid, so the plant can't replace water lost by transpiration, that wax is going to help prevent moisture loss and reduce the risk of winter burn. In species which inhabit deserts that have sclerophylls, for example, this manzanita, which is the shrub in the bottom image, the reason they have a thick waxy cuticle is to prevent water loss during drought. But both of these are broadleaf evergreen plants. Um, because of all of the investment in making the leaf really tough and hard and waxy, sclerophylous leaves or sclerophylls, they're more costly for the plant to make. They require a lot more glucose. They require a lot more food to build. And so a plant has to photosynthesize with sclerophylls much longer before they break even, meaning that the leaf has produced via photosynthesis the same amount of food that was required to make the leaf. Um, so it's kind of a quality over quantity strategy. Most of our deciduous plants, they don't put a lot of resources into developing the leaves. They just reabsorb the nutrients and then shed them and just regrow new leaves next year. They're not really super worried about the quality because they know that next year they're going to have new leaves. Sclerophylous plants want to make sure that their leaves are of super high quality and then that they can be used for several years continuously without breaking down, which allows them to kind of recover the high initial cost of investment in growing their leaves. Bud scales are, I think, a valuable type of modified leaf to be aware of. These are thickened, waxy, and often densely packed leaves which protect the buds or apical meristem, as it's called, of a plant during dormancy. And one of the reasons I think it's very useful to be aware of bud scales is that they're super useful for the identification of dormant woody plants. So this top image, we can see that witch hazel, striped maple, big tooth aspen, bitternut hickory, willow, and red oak all have very distinctive bud scale shapes, colors, and textures. So if you're familiar with bud scales and you know what they look like on a particular species, you can identify that species any time of year. And skilled nursery people can do this. And skilled ecologists as well, and foresters. They can go out in a nursery or out in a forest and say, okay, well, I don't know what the leaves look like because they've been shed, they've been abscised for the winter, but I can look at other features like the bark or the bud scales of this tree and figure out, who this is, what species of tree this is. One thing that's really interesting about these bud scales is the bud scales can be arranged in different ways. They can be valvate, meaning that you've got basically two main bud scales that will split open when it's mature, or they can be imbricate, meaning they're interlocking um, series of these modified bud scale leaves that help protect the bud. And sometimes we have entire inflorescences or floral structures which are pre-formed within these bud scales, ready to go to bloom in the spring. If we look at this really, really large cross section of an aesculus or horse chestnut um, bud, we can actually see these little round structures inside of the bud scales, and those are actually preformed flower buds of the inflorescence of the horse chestnut, just waiting through the winter, and then once the tissue starts to grow in the spring when things warm up, that flower bud is already ready to go, and that tree will be able to flower super early in the spring. Not all of the buds on a plant have preformed flower buds. Typically, the buds which have flower buds in them are larger than purely vegetative buds, and you can see that many of these do have kind of different sizes or shapes of buds, which might have different behavior. Some of them might just produce vegetative shoots. Some of them might produce flowering shoots or inflorescences in the spring. Um, so far, we've looked mostly at the kind of internal structures of a leaf and the process of going dormant and the processes of photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and um, transpiration. But it's also important to be able to recognize the external anatomy of a leaf, which we'll try to move through a little bit quickly because I'm already going a little bit long. Um, we're going to talk about the stipule, petiole, lamina, midrib veins, and some other parts, okay? The stipules are small paired leaf-like structures found where the leaf attaches to the stem. So these are technically part of the leaf, and they are considered persistent if they remain attached after the leaf is fully developed, or caducous if they are shed after the leaf is fully developed. On some species, you might not find any stipules at all, but it's also possible that the plant did have stipules earlier in the year, but that once those leaves fully developed, they were shed. Um, Stipules can come in a lot of different shapes depending on the species of plant, and as such, they can be very useful for identification of a particular plant. The petiole is just the stalk that attaches the blade of the leaf to the stem. Okay, the leaf blade is just the flattened, expanded portion of the leaf. If we look in this top right corner, we can see a shoot of quaking aspen. Quaking aspens have long, flexible, flattened petioles, and that's what allows the leaves to flutter in the wind, to spill the wind so that the leaves don't act like sails, which could potentially blow the tree over in high winds. Um, I would like to stress that the petiole is not a stem. Petioles do not have nodes. Petioles do not have buds. Petioles are just a portion of a leaf that is delivering water, minerals, sugars into and out of the leaf. So it's just the stalk of the leaf. It is not a stem. It does not have buds. It does not have nodes. When we eat celery, for example, we are eating the petiole of the plant. The stem is actually that really compact crown at the base of the celery. If you've ever peeled all the leaves or petioles off of a celery, you can actually get down all the way to the central bud of the celery, and that's the tip of the stem. The stem is really just that disc at the bottom. And we prefer to eat the petiole of celery or the stalk of the leaf. The lamina is also called the leaf blade, and that's the flattened, expanded portion of the leaf. Um, A lot of people get confused and they think that the leaf blade is the edge of the leaf. That is not the case. The lamina or the leaf blade is the flat portion of the leaf that is it's capturing light for photosynthesis. Okay. Um, all leaf parts that aren't the petiole or stipules are all parts of the lamina. So, for example, the veins are part of the lamina, the cuticle is part of the lamina, the epidermis, etc. And in some cases, we can have a pretty heavily modified lamina. For example, on these Victoria water lilies, we have a lamina where the underside of the leaf is covered in spines, and that prevents herbivorous tropical fish from devouring the leaves of the Victoria water lily. The midrib is the central vein of a leaf, and if you want to understand its function besides transporting resources, because obviously as a vein, it's going to be transporting resources within the leaf, things like water, mineral nutrients, and sugar. You can take a piece of paper and you can hold it from the edge. And if you hold a piece of paper from the edge, it will flop. But if you put a fold in the middle of that piece of paper lengthwise and then hold it from the fold, that piece of paper will then become rigid and be able to stand up properly. So the midrib often adds an element of structural support or a slight fold to the center of the leaf to increase its structural strength. And in some cases, the midrib is extraordinarily modified. For example, in these pitcher plants, Nepenthes, um, we see that the midrib extends out of the tip of the leaf down and then ends in this giant trumpet-shaped pitcher for catching insects. So there are species which have done some really, really interesting things with their midribs. The veins, I suppose, somewhat obviously transport resources around the leaf and provide structural support to the leaf, kind of like little struts. Um, and when we look at the veins, we aren't just interested in their function, we're also interested in the shapes they make because they're useful for plant identification. Um, in the flowering plants, the angiosperms, there are two main groups, the dicots and the monocots. And in the dicots, we tend to see branching leaf veins, and they can be palmate, meaning that they all kind of branch out from a single point. They all branch out from the petiole. They can be pinnate, meaning they have the shape of a feather. There's a central vein and then branching veins off of that central vein. They can be reticulate, meaning that they are net shaped, and they can be many other configurations. Um, by comparison, monocots tend to have parallel leaf veins that all run the same direction. This isn't true of all groups of monocots, but as a general pattern within the monocots, we often have parallel leaf veins that all run the same way, as we might see in grasses or palms. The margin is the edge of the leaf. It's the edge of the lamina or the leaf blade. Do not confuse the leaf blade with the margin. The margin is the edge. The leaf blade is the flattened lamina of the leaf. The margin can be a lot of different shapes as well, and it can be super useful for identification. The margin can also often be used to defend the leaf from herbivores. So, for example, if we look at this holly branch in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that the margin of the leaf is spiny, and that would prevent an herbivore like a deer from being terribly interested in eating those leaves. And hollies, interestingly enough, only produce spiny margin leaves on their lower branches. The upper branches, which are out of the reach of deer, actually produce an entire margin. Entire meaning that it's a smooth margin with no spines. Um, Anyone who's ever grown a lot of ornamental grasses will know that some ornamental grasses have a margin which can be very, very sharp if you rub the margin of the leaf the wrong way, and you can actually cut yourself open. And you can imagine that if you're a cow, or an elephant, or a gazelle, or an antelope, or any type of animal grazing on grasses, you probably are not going to be super excited about grazing on a grass which has the ability to slice your lips open with its saw-like leaf margin. So margins can be valuable in defending the plant from herbivores, and we can also certainly look at the shapes that are made by the margins in order to figure out what species of plant we're looking at. The apex is the tip of the leaf. You might think about an apex predator being at the tip or top of the food chain. Um, the apices are very useful for plant identification. So, for example, if we look at this agave species, we can see that the apex or the tip of the leaf has been modified into a thickened woody spine. And having had several interactions with such spines on agave myself, I can tell you that those spines will grow right through denim pants and straight into your leg, which would make them incredibly challenging to feed on if you were, for example, a deer or some other kind of herbivore. The apex can also be modified for other special functions. And certainly, once again, very useful for identification. We can look at the shape of a leaf and compare it to some kind of key and determine what the shape of the apex is and whether or not that matches the expected traits for a particular species of plant. Leaves can also be a lot of different shapes, and the shape of the leaf can, once again, be super useful for plant identification. One thing I'd like to stress is that a lot of people misidentify species that look very, very similar to each other. So I've provided two different images of very, very similar leaves. The top leaf is the leaf of the London plane tree, Platanus acerifolia, in the family Platanaceae, and it looks very similar to the leaf of Acer platanoides, the Norway maple, which is in the family Sapindaceae in the lower image. These are two very unrelated species. They're not even in the same family, but the leaves look quite similar if you don't look too closely. The devil is always in the details on leaf ID. So take a second to look at those leaves and see if you can spot some key differences. One difference that I automatically notice is that in the London plane tree in the top image, the two lowest lobes of the leaf have veins which branch off of another main vein, whereas in the Norway maple, all of the veins originate at a single central point where the petiole meets the leaf blade. So there's a difference in the configuration of the veins, and the margin of the leaf, while similar, is not quite the same in each one. I would say that there are more teeth on the leaf of the London plane tree. So if you're really paying attention to some of the details, that can take you a long way in clearly identifying different species of plants. Plants are also capable of dividing their leaves into smaller leaflets rather than having just one single solid continuous lamina. So a simple leaf has a single continuous lamina. All of the midrib and veins of the leaf are all webbed by leaf lamina into one continuous surface. Compound leaves have a lamina or a leaf blade which has been divided into many leaflets, and each leaflet is supplied um, resources through a vein of the leaf. Okay. In a pinnately compound leaves, the leaflets are attached to the rachis, which is basically the midrib, but it's a free midrib that isn't enclosed in lamina or leaf blade tissue. And there are two different configurations of pinnately compound leaves that we can see. And you can see these in this bottom diagram on the left side. Odd pinnate leaves end in one leaflet. So there's just one single leaflet at the tip of the rachis or the midrib. In even pinnate leaves, we see two leaflets at the end of the leaf. The leaf ends in paired leaflets at the tip of the rachis or midrib. In a bipinnately compound leaf, we're basically dividing a compound leaf again into even smaller leaflets. In this case, we refer to the midrib as the rachis, and then the small lateral veins as rachilla, as a rachilla or rachillae is plural. And so rather than having the leaflets attached to the rachis, which is the midrib, they are attached to lateral veins called rachilla. Um, and so bipinnately compound leaves are very, very much more structurally complex. We can have leaves which are tripinnately compound or three times divided. And my favorite example of a tripinnately compound leaf is thalictrum, which is called meadow rue. And we can see an image of a thalictrum leaf in the top right corner. We can see that there's a midrib called the rachis. And then we have the rachilla, which are the lateral veins which branch off of the midrib. And then I don't know what the name is for the tertiary veins that are branching off, but the leaflets are attached to those tertiary and sometimes quaternary um, veins in a really, really highly divided um, leaflet. And then palmately compound leaves, they have palmate venation, meaning that all of the veins are branching from the petiole itself, like the fingers of a hand. Um, and yeah, those are the different types of compound leaves. Uh, there are a couple of different reasons why a plant might want to have compound leaves. One of the main reasons is that it allows the flow of air through the tree more effectively without acting as much like a sail. If you have a bunch of simple leaves, those simple leaves are really large and broad and they can catch a lot of wind, whereas a feathery compound leaf can shed wind more effectively in a windstorm, which reduces the likelihood of branch or trunk breakage. Um, it can also slow the rate of airflow through a tree, and there's a couple other advantages to these species that have compound leaves. Leaf arrangement is also called phyllotaxy, and that's just the pattern of leaf attachment to the stem of a plant. The leaves of a plant are always arranged on the stem such that the plant can minimize self-shading, so that each leaf is as exposed to the sunlight as possible. And looking at phyllotaxy is super useful for plant ID because any individual species of plants tends to only exhibit one phyllotaxy pattern. Um, we describe phyllotaxy as alternate if we have a single leaf at each node. We describe the phyllotaxy or leaf arrangement as opposite if we have two leaves at each node along the stem. And we consider the phyllotaxy to be whorled if we have many leaves at each node. And typically, in the axil of each leaf, where the leaf meets the stem, we have one bud. Not always, but that's certainly typically the case. Whether we have an alternate, opposite, or whorled leaf arrangement often influences the branching pattern that we see in the plant later because there's typically a bud at the base of each leaf as well. There are some other phyllotaxies. I'm not going to get into the weeds on those. Just be aware that there are other terms to describe other phyllotaxy patterns. For example, distichous means it's a type of alternate leaf arrangement in which the leaves basically form two um, opposite files from each other. Spiral is another type, so just be aware that there are other types of leaf arrangement. Um, Once again, we're going to try to move a little more quickly through these modified leaf types. There are several. We're going to start with variegation. Variegated leaves, they feature spots or patterns of another color besides the base color of the leaf. In wild plants, we can have naturally occurring variegations. Sometimes these serve to camouflage plants so that a herbivore does not recognize them as a plant. Sometimes they serve other functions. A lot of our plants that we grow in horticulture actually have artificial variegation that they have been artificially selected for, and we value that as an ornamental feature. We might have extra patches of yellow or white or red or pink on a leaf, and that might make the plant a little bit prettier for a human being to look at. And so the variegated plants are often very popular horticultural species. One thing that's important to know about artificial variegations, I don't have time here to discuss how these variegations occur developmentally, but it's important to know that a plant can revert back to producing normal solid green leaves if the variegation isn't maintained. So if you ever see a shoot of green leaves on a variegated plant, it's important to go and prune that all the way back into some variegated material so that the new shoots that grow out from that material are variegated again. If you don't, otherwise you can end up with a shrub that's maybe, or a tree that's half variegated and half not variegated. So it's important with a variegated plant to keep an eye on it and make sure that you are removing any portions that have lost their variegation back into a branch that is variegated to maintain that trait. Bracts we've talked a little bit about in our unit about flowers. Bracts are modified leaves which are found in association with flowers or other reproductive structures. Bracts can be really small and inconspicuous, or they can be super large and showy. And we see different types of bracts in different species. When we look at a plant like a poinsettia, which we can see in the top right corner, we can see that the bracts are these bright red modified leaves which surround the inflorescence. And the inflorescence is composed of that little cluster of yellow flowers in the center of that whorl of bracts. We can tell that they're leaves not only because they have all the parts of a leaf, including a petiole. Petals typically don't have a petiole, but leaves typically do have a petiole, and the bracts of poinsettias certainly have a petiole. Another reason we can tell is at the very bottom of this poinsettia, in this top right corner, we can see that the leaves farther down are completely green, but then we have some transitional leaves with some red pigmentation, and then at the top of the plant, pigmented bract leaves right before we produce the inflorescence. So those are not actually petals. When you buy a poinsettia for Christmas, they are modified leaves called bracts. Um, Another good example of a plant with bracts is a sunflower. When you look at the back of a sunflower, we know that a sunflower is in the family Asteraceae, the daisy family. And a feature of that family is that the disc in the center of the flower is actually composed of tiny little florets or individual flowers. So the whole sunflower is not one flower, it is actually a disc composed of numerous flowers. And each of those flowers has its own four floral whorls: a calyx, corolla, andrecium, and gynecium. So when we look at the back of the sunflower, we might normally have thought that that was the calyx or those modified leaves which protect the flower bud before opening, but really these are involucres, okay? This is a whorl of bracts which is surrounding the entire inflorescence of the sunflower before it opens. As you look through a lot of these images, you can see the flowers in the middles of some of the flowers, or you can identify the petals, and then you can see that there are some modified, often colorful leaves surrounding those flowers that maybe help support the function of that reproductive structure. Needles and scales are modified leaves, mostly of conifers that are much better at photosynthesizing in very cold or dry conditions compared to broadleaves. They lose less water because they have less surface area and fewer stomata, so there's less risk of winter burn. Um, and Needles are typical of plants in the pine family. That's Pinaceae, including pines, spruces, and firs. And scales are typical of plants in the cypress family, Cupressaceae, and the monkey puzzle family, Araucariaceae. That would include species like cypresses, junipers, sequoias, etc. One of the advantages of these sclerophyll needles and scales is that they continue to function for multiple years. So even though it's more investment to produce them, they last typically for several years, and so the tree gets more mileage out of every leaf it produces. Um, the scales of bulbs are also modified leaves. The bulb plate in the bottom of the bulb, if you've ever cut open an onion, you'll be very familiar that there's a hard little disc at the base of the onion that isn't the most tasty. So typically we cut that off and throw it away. That's the actual stem, and we can tell it's the stem because it has nodes and has leaves attached, and it connects the leaves to the roots. And we always have to have a stem between our leaves and our roots. So that bulb plate at the bottom of the bulb, that is the stem. The scales or layers of the bulb are modified fleshy leaves, and their function is to store sugars and water to fuel plant growth after the plant is as a plant is emerging from dormancy. There are two main types of bulbs. Tunicate bulbs, they actually allow their outermost scale to dry out, and that produces this papery tunic that's kind of waxy, and that keeps the bulb from drying out. So if you've ever had to peel the papery layers off of an onion, you are removing a dried out a dried out tunic, which is just an outermost bulb scale, which has been allowed to dry to basically saran wrap um, that bulb and keep moisture in. Scaly bulbs, they lack a tunic. They don't have that dried, papery, waxy outer layer, which means they dry out much more easily. They cannot grow in dry soils, and they cannot be stored for long periods in like a box, the way that you can with tunicate bulbs. That makes it a little bit harder to order them and ship them. As a horticulturist, you have to make sure that they are stored properly and get planted right away after they are shipped. And that would include species like the true lilies and also fritillaries. Succulent leaves, these are thickened leaves which are modified for water storage. We're all familiar with things like aloes or hens and chicks that can have these thick, plump leaves, which are full of cells that are packed full of water. Some species take this adaptation a step farther, and they actually have windows in their succulent leaves. And that window is a transparent surface and interior of the leaf that allows light to shine onto a thinner layer of photosynthetic tissue within the leaf. And that allows this thick leaf, which wouldn't normally be that great at photosynthesis, to do a lot more photosynthesis than it normally be able to. So if we look at this bottom image of this Fenestraria plant, you can see that the top of the leaf is actually transparent and light is shining through it, which is why it looks a little bit paler. And the tissue that actually does photosynthesis is that darker green layer around the outside of the leaf. And all of the inner tissue of the leaf is actually transparent. So light can basically shine into the leaf as if it were like a telescope or some kind of tube, and the inner lining of the leaf can do photosynthesis, but the leaf is able to minimize its amount of surface area, so it's able to reduce the amount of water that's lost via transpiration to the environment, which is a very valuable trait for a plant to have in a desert. Spines are also leaves. Okay, so when you look at a cactus and you look at the spines on a cactus, those are the leaves of the cactus. These are sharp, rigid leaves. They're kind of woody often to make them stiff enough to puncture the skin of animals. And this is just another, weapons development in the history of the arms race between plants and animals. Plants continue to evolve methods to prevent animals from eating them, and animals continually retaliate with new evolutionary traits that help them overcome plants' defenses. For example, cacti can sometimes be consumed by camels because camels have very tough, leathery lips and digestive tracts to help them tolerate those spines. And the spines can be formed from the entire leaf or from any other part of the leaf. We've talked about agave, leaf apexes being woody and spiny, being able to make it through your pants and stab into your leg. We've also talked about hollies in the genus Ilex and how they have spines around the margin of the leaf, which would prevent deer from wanting to eat them. So any sharp object that a plant has made with a leaf in order to deter herbivores is a spine. Plants are also capable of producing traps with their leaves. What you need to know about these plants that produce traps, we call them carnivorous plants or meat-eating plants. They're not consuming insects for energy. They're not consuming them for food. They are catching insects and digesting their bodies for the mineral nutrients that their bodies contain, not for the calories. These plants are plants. They do photosynthesis. They produce sugars. The problem is they can't get the mineral nutrients they need, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur from the waterlogged, boggy soils they live in. So in a bog, you have flowing water basically going through this kind of bog or marsh ecosystem. And because the water is constantly flowing, it dissolves all of the mineral nutrients out of the soil and carries them away. Plus, there's a lot of competition between different plants in a marsh or bog for the mineral nutrients that are remaining in the soil. So the carnivorous plants have adapted to that challenging environment by catching insects and digesting their bodies and absorbing the mineral nutrients out of them that they would normally get from the soil in order to allow themselves to grow. This is also something that you see more in tropical rainforests. In tropical rainforests, it can rain so much that all of the mineral nutrients in the soil dissolve and are washed away. And so some of our species of carnivorous plants are also found in rainforests or sometimes in ponds that have very low levels of nutrients in them. Some have pitfall traps or pitchers. Some have snap traps like the Venus flytrap. Some have flypaper traps like Pingicula, which you can see in the middle left, and which has these flat, sticky leaves, which flies get stuck to, where they get to just digest it on the leaf surface. We can also have vacuum traps. In the bottom image, we see Utricularia, which has vacuum traps. It's got these little pouches or bladders which implode and suck water inward if like a little aquatic invertebrate, like a mosquito larva, swims by them. They get vacuumed into one of those little bladders and digested. And they can also have glandular tentacles or mucilaginous trichomes. So trichomes are hairs that are produced on the surface of the leaf, and they can be used for anything from protecting the plant from sunlight by reflecting light. A lot of times, plants that have a dense layer of white hairs, those trichomes help reflect light and prevent water loss in a desert. Um, they sometimes help defend a plant against predators, as in the case with stinging nettle. The trichomes are little hairs filled with venom on the stinging nettle. On the sundews, which are in the genus Drosera, which we can see in the top right-hand corner, we can see that each little red trichome is tipped with a droplet of mucilage, or basically kind of like a mucus. And that mucus contains digestive enzymes, or basically proteins that the plant uses to break down the body of the insect so that it can absorb mineral nutrients out of the insect's body. So there's a lot of different ways that plants have evolved mechanisms to capture insects, digest their bodies, and absorb the mineral nutrients they contain. Once again, they're not capturing the insects for food. They can produce food themselves by doing photosynthesis. They need to catch the bodies of these animals and digest them and absorb them in order to get the mineral nutrients they need to need in order to survive in their nutrient poor environments where all the mineral nutrients in the soil have been washed away. A leaf tendril is a leaf that's modified to feel for and wrap around a support structure. Some examples could include like peas or clematis. And tendrils can develop from, once again, any part of the leaf, petioles, stipules, midribs, or the veins of the leaf. In some of our garden peas, the entire leaf, if you look at this garden pea picture in the bottom right, you can see that the leaves sticking out the side. All of the veins of the leaf are free. They're not connected by any kind of lamina or leaf blade. And so the every vein of the leaf can act as a tendril to wrap around and climb up some surface. And then the surface of the tissue of the pea plant that's actually doing most of the photosynthesis are those paired stipules, or those paired leaf-like structures at the base of the leaf where the leaf meets the stem. That's what's actually doing most of the photosynthesis in some of our varieties of field peas. Um, yeah, tendrils. I hope we're all familiar with tendrils. Okay. Leaf hooks are similar to tendrils, but these are basically kind of sharp, rigid hooks that help some vining plants anchor themselves to rough surfaces like tree bark. You could think of them as like a modified tendril, and once again, those hooks are formed from modified veins of a leaflet. And you can see them in these species like cat's claw vine, dolichondra, or crossvine, bignonia. Bignonia is actually a really beautiful ornamental flowering vine that you can grow here in zone 7A. Epiphyly is a trait that some plants have where they produce non-leaf tissues from parts of the leaf. Some plants like Blesnaria have the ability to, Beslaria, not Blesnaria. Beslaria macropoda has the ability to produce flowers and fruits from the leaf itself. They don't have to produce them from buds emerging from the stem. They just sprout them out right out of the middle of the leaf, which is pretty weird. Um, some other plants will produce, flowers or fruits from the leaf. Some will produce little baby plantlets. That trait's called epiphyly. Um, Sometimes people will confuse epiphyllous leaves with bracts, but plants with bracts usually have differentiated like normal leaves and then the modified bract leaves. Epiphyllous plants usually have the ability to produce these non-leaf tissues from any leaf on the whole plant. So that's an important difference between a bract, which would normally be associated with like a flower, and epiphyly is epiphyly. In an epiphyllous plant, you might produce a flower from any leaf, whereas in a plant that produces bracts, you'll have specialized leaves that are bract and non-specialized leaves, which are for photosynthesis. In some species, the photosynthesis does not primarily occur through the lamina. It actually occurs through a flattened petiole, and that's called a phylode. This is a particularly interesting case in trees in the genus Acacia, which are very common in Africa and Australia. If we look at this diagram, the bottommost leaf on this stem is a bipinnately compound juvenile acacia leaf. And then as we move up the stem, we can see how the uh, the plant, as it matures, can reduce the amount of leaflets on the leaf, and it can expand and flatten the petiole. And it basically will use the petiole instead of the lamina to do photosynthesis. And the advantage there is that by reducing the surface area of the leaf, the acacia can limit water loss. So phyllodes, or the possession of phyllodes rather than a normal leaf, is more common in some of our Australian species of acacia that have to tolerate the much drier conditions in Australia compared to some of our African acacia species, which usually get a nice rainy season. Foliar domatia, these are modified leaves that provide housing for insects, and these are typically ants or predatory mites. In the case of ants, often these are plants are called ant plants, and the ants will actually sometimes have their entire colony housed within these modified leaves of the plant. And because the entire colony is housed within the plant, the ants will defend the plant just like they would defend an anthill, which it protects the plant from herbivores that might want to eat it. But also, the colony is disposing of their waste material within the foliar domatia. So in this case, the plant can actually absorb nutrients directly from the inner surface of the leaf where these insects are living. In the case of predatory mites, they're often much smaller, little like pockets on the underside of a leaf, and the mites might go into those pockets to lay their eggs to protect them from predators, and then those predatory mites will hatch, and they will run all over that plant hunting for any kinds of prey like aphids or other pests that might be feeding on the plant. So basically, the plant, in exchange for providing a safe home for that ant or mite, receives protection from herbivores and also sometimes their wastes. And some of those ant plants are actually really popular tropical novelty houseplants, so good to be aware of. I think this is probably the last slide. I'm going to see if there's one more, but if there isn't another slide, I wish you the best of luck in your studies this week. And I hope you were able to learn a lot about the physiology of leaves, the internal anatomy of leaves, the external anatomy of leaves, and how plants are capable of modifying their leaves through evolutionary processes in order to favor their survival. Oh, we do have one more type of leaf, and that is a propagative leaf. So, propagative leaves are leaves which produce plantlets, and that's going to allow a plant to vegetatively propagate itself. So, these are plants which are going to form while they're still attached to the mother plant. Sometimes they're referred to as epiphyllous embryos. So if we look at this Asplenium bulbiferum fern in the top image, this fern is producing little plantlets while they're still attached to the mother plant, and it's actually going to drop those baby plants to the forest floor in the moist forest floor environment where it lives, and those little baby plants are going to be able to root in. So the plantlets could have formed while they're still attached to the mother plant, or the plant can shed its leaves, as we see in like jade plants or some echiverias and other succulents, and the leaf can actually root it into the soil, and then after it's rooted, it can grow a little baby plant, and from there, kind of produce a bigger plant and reproduce itself that way. So that's a one last type of modified leaf. Like I said, I hope that this was useful to you for understanding the physiology of leaves, the internal anatomy of leaves, the external anatomy of leaves, and modifications of leaves.